morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's event hosted by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I just want to start by expressing my sincere thanks to the members of FPRI's board, our supporters, our members. Many of you are here today, and it's because of your contributions that we can do these kind of talks. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Jae-hyun Park. He's a non-resident fellow here at FPRI in our Asia program. He's also a professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He's coming to us from Asia, from Singapore today, so he's going to burn some midnight oil to enlighten us all. Jae-hyun, he brings a wealth of experience in international relations theory, and he does a very good job of combining big theoretical ideas on world politics with specific granular information on East Asian security as well as US foreign policy. Right now, he's working on a fascinating book project called The Geographical Pivot of Grand Strategy, where he looks at rising powers, especially in East Asia, particularly in the 1895 to 1905 period, and analyzes how geography, technology, institutions shape all these different countries' geopolitical orientations and what the lessons that we might learn for today. And so for this project, he was actually awarded a prestigious Smith Richardson Foundation Strategy and Policy Fellowship. Beyond his book research, he's been published widely in many different journals, the Texas National Security Review, Orbis. He's also contributed to leading outlets like the Council on Foreign Relations, War on the Rocks. And he also does a fair amount of government consulting, both for the United States and South Korea. He's consulted for the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. He did his studies at the Center for Grand Strategy at Texas A&M and the Clements Center for National Security, the Notre Dame International Security Center, and he was also a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission from 2020 to 2023. So I could go on and on about all of Jae-hyun's credentials, but we got to get to the talk. He's going to be presenting a paper that he's been working on called China's Strategic Frontiers, and he's going to give us a geopolitical assessment of China's aims and goals and situation, basically offering us going around the corners of the compass, essentially, and giving us a comprehensive analysis of China's eastern, southern, western, and northern frontiers, and looking at how China views all these different regions, how it balances its resources among them, and what that implies for Chinese foreign policy going forward. So Jae-hyun's going to give us a quick presentation over the next 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'll ask some questions. If you have questions for him, just put them in the chat, and then I can work them into our discussion. So Jae-hyun, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the extremely generous introduction. I think the more senior you get, I think your bio becomes shorter, and the long bio of myself means that I have a long ladder to climb. And I really appreciate Mike and Connor and the Foreign Policy Research Institute for hosting my research here. Allow me to present my research here. I have been a huge fan, as a student of geopolitics, I've been a huge fan of the FPRI's works. And obviously, Mike's works on East Asian security and international security have been really inspirational for me as well. So I really appreciate this opportunity. So I guess what I'm trying to do is it is entitled China Strategic Frontiers, a Geopolitical Assessment. So let me just preface by saying that I'm not a sinologist by training. What that means is that I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people who have much more extensive knowledge on China-specific aspects of Chinese foreign policy or China in general. But what I'm trying to do here is to do a little bit of a theoretical exercise, looking at China's various frontiers from a geopolitical perspective. And I prepared a little slide here, so I think I might as well just share the screen with you. Okay. And right. So from my vantage point, geopolitics is really a theory of foreign policy informing the direction of grand strategy or foreign policy with geographic reference. And what kind of values do theories have? Well, from Social Sciences 101, we know that theories are supposed to have heuristic and predictive values. What do I mean by that? Heuristic value is kind of, giving you some organization or structure of infinite amount of data. So I remember having this conversation in the thick of my dissertation writing with one of my supervisors, who basically told me that, you have too much information. Our business is not really a phone book making. You have to organize your sort of data or information according to some logic, and that's one aspect of theory. And the second part is a predictive value, and I believe it was Milton Friedman who said, theory gives you sort of non-contrarian or counterintuitive predictions, which really is the value of predictive value of theory. So that's what I'm trying to do. And the argument that I'm trying to make is pretty simple. It is really, while contemporary debates, both academic and policy debates on China's foreign policy have been centered around whether what China is going to do with Taiwan. China actually has three other frontiers. Taiwan is only one of them. So it's eastern frontier. The other frontiers are northern, western, and southern. And from my vantage point, western and southern frontiers allow for much easier access to the rest of the world, for which China has been investing a lot of money and resources. And these places, especially Myanmar and Pakistan, are politically unstable, for which China might get involved or bogged down much more precisely in these places in the coming years. So I initially had a long sort of a list of things that I wanted to share with the audience, but given the amount of time I have, I'll be brief, and I can go over the slides in the appendix section. The two basic concepts have to be clarified before I move forward. So one is frontier, and the other is geopolitics. So I use the term frontier, not border, because frontier is a much more trans-historical concept than border. So this is a map, I think, created by the French in the 16th century, showing the entire globe. As you can see, maps were not very precise. The borders had not been delineated, but the situation changed over time. This is the map, I think, created around the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century. So a lot of the different things happened in between. So cartographic developments, exploration, the development of state institution, and so on and so forth. These kind of things made border making or delineated borders of nation states much more clearly. So that is the reason why I used frontier versus border. And also in the Chinese context, a lot of PLA analysts or scholars of Chinese defense strategy make distinction between border defense and frontier defense, the latter of which actually implies the element of domestic stability and maintenance, because China's domestic peripheries, such as Xinjiang and Tibet, are not as stable as one might think. So that's a distinction between frontier and border. And often we focus on, in the usual journalistic accounts, we focus on border disputes or territorial disputes, but in many cases these disputes can be subjugated or deprioritized by the party, one of the party members of the territorial disputes, depending on their political and broader strategic circumstances. And this is kind of a synthesis of various geopolitical models from the last century. And to me, geopolitics is essentially identifying the hottest real estates in world politics. And from the vantage point of foreign policy, it tries to inform or anticipate where states will expand. So, and to do so, you have to have some sort of analytical framework by which you organize information and predict the direction of foreign policy. So contemporary international relations and geopolitical literature have various models, but I apply this ends, means, and ways chain to synthesize different things, and I focus on buffers and resource centers as primary geographic objectives of statecraft, and lines of communications as means or secondary objective secondary geographic objective of statecraft. So in summary, I focus on China's strategic buffers or strategic buffers, excuse me, resource centers and lines of communications. And to give you a little bit of historical sense of how China has expanded or contracted, China began with the northern plain and moved all the way down to the what we now consider as China's economic core. And throughout history, China's frontiers have remained pretty stable, according to sinologist Owen Lattimore. So basically, excuse me. So basically, there were three frontiers of successive Chinese dynasties. Four frontiers: Manchuria, Mongolia, Turkestan, and Tibet. And these frontiers have persisted throughout history. And with the introduction of European powers in the late 19th century, the maritime frontier was open to the China as well. And there are a couple of maps that I wanted to show you that I just skipped over before. Excuse me. This is a map, Japanese campaign maps of the Second World War. As you can see, Japan basically accessed China from Korea in the beginning, and then sort of gradually moved on from Manchuria. But after the fall of Guangzhou, the large bulk of materials flowed through Indochina, Burma, Xinjiang, and that is sort of Japan accessed through these routes. But if you flip the question, China's expansion route through the high sea would be in reverse order. But Korea now, we have buffer zones in North Korea, and then Taiwan is sort of semi-blocked with the U.S. support, and so there is Indochina and Burma that allow for easier access to the high seas, especially sort of avoiding the Strait of Malacca.
Hey, Jaihan, can you try we see the first slide in your slide deck, but I don't think most people can see the map, so I don't know if there's a way that you can toggle to it. Otherwise, if not, you can just continue.
I think okay, let me just, I don't know why screen sharing is paused.
Okay, we'll try to work on it on our end too. Why don't you go ahead?
All right, so let's try something else. You still cannot see that, or?
I'm still seeing the first slide in your slide deck.
Okay. Now you see it, or?
Yep, now we're good.
All right, so I will go over all the maps before. So this is the map that I was just mentioning, the World War II Japan's campaign maps. And this is the development of Chinese dynasties throughout history. That shows that basically the core of the Chinese polity began with the northern plain and moved down all the way to the South China, which is now the economic center of gravity. Okay, so China used to have what we call military regions in the beginning, and the number of military regions declined over time, sort of manifesting that military's intervention in domestic politics has sort of phased out. And now, around 2014 and 2015, China reorganized military regions into theater commands. So now we have 5 theater commands: Central, Northern, Western, Southern, and Eastern theater commands. And with the exception of Central Theater Command that defends the Beijing area, the 4 different theater commands represent, in my view, 4 different strategic frontiers that China has. And each of these frontiers contains different regions, but also contains different powers, some of which can serve as potential competitors to China. So from the vantage point of geopolitics, I've just mentioned that the key things to look for are buffers, resource centers, and lines of communications. So from that vantage point, I just wanted to show you a couple of maps. So the first, buffers, because the center, political economic center of China lies in the northern plain and southern economic zone. The first island chain and second island chain are considered China's buffers and areas lying within it. And Taiwan, for that matter, is an important part because it really sits at the center of First Island Chain, or the North, South, and East China Seas. But as long as Taiwan does not declare independence, China will unlikely try to invade Taiwan, because it's really hard to pull off the amphibious operations. And Mike's great work on emerging military balance in East Asia has taught us that it's the United States has various other mechanisms by which it can sort of deter China when that happens. From the vantage point of resource centers, China, well, if you look at the statistics, China's largest economic partner by region now is ASEAN, and followed by European Union. So China and the bulk of Chinese trade goes through the sea. So China has to secure the sea lanes, and more importantly, the critical resources, including Middle Eastern oil, flows through the Strait of Malacca. So if you don't use Strait of Malacca, you have to use Lombok and Sunda Straits, which will be much more expensive and time consuming. So that is the reason why some Chinese strategists, I think it was Hu Jintao who mentioned the Malacca dilemma, but that is the reason why China has to figure out a way to sort of avoid this Malacca Strait. And these two maps show how China has been trying to do that. So easiest access routes to the Indian Ocean are offered by Myanmar and Pakistan. And then China has been trying to build railways connecting the Strait of Malacca with Singapore as a terminus with the Kunming in Yunnan province. But the problem is that Myanmar and Pakistan are fundamentally very unstable places. So if you look at this in indices, they are at the bottom of the rank of internal stability in Asia. So there's an ample chance that Myanmar and Pakistan would would invite Chinese intervention. So what does it mean for the United States? Well, what does it mean concretely for China and the United States? There's a two particular. So I want to proceed. There's policy implications in two steps. So China, from Chinese vantage point, one has to answer two questions, I think. Whether China will actually use force abroad, because its longstanding principle has been non-intervention, and the second part is whether territorial conquest pay, and from the and then the United States, how the United States should respond. From China's vantage point, I think there has been a series of developments that tell us that the decision will be much more politically determined as opposed to legally determined. So, China had created this anti-counterterrorism law in 2015, and it started building the base in Djibouti and so on and so forth. So a lot of PLA experts or other Chinese experts have been saying that it's going to be more a matter of timing when China will actually use force abroad. And it actually has been patrolling in, I think, Wakhan Corridor and deployed PAP, the People's Armed Police in Tajikistan. Second part, whether territorial conquest pay or not, there are a lot of scholars from, long time immemorial who have been arguing that territorial conquest do not pay because of technological developments, economic interdependence, and so on and so forth. But I think states respond to it in very creative ways. So some people say that fait accompli strategy has been replacing the traditional conquest, and others say that states have numerous different ways to mobilize and coerce conquered lands to make it pay off. And if you look at the recent developments in world politics, from the Russia's invasion of Ukraine all the way to the Israel's war in the Middle East, I think states have still, territorial expansion and conquest are really important strategy that states still employ. And from the vantage point of the United States, these other frontiers, I can go over the specifics of different frontiers in the Q&A session. But from the United States vantage point, Taiwan, the maritime frontier, if it can be defended, it has to divert away China's attention to the continental frontiers. So what do I mean by that? Or how does the United States achieve that? There are two ways. So one is to forge a balancing coalition. Obvious contenders are Russia and India, and a lot of people have been arguing about how to sort of create a wedge between Russia and China. I don't think that's going to happen, given that the increasingly close relationship between Moscow and Beijing. Second contender is India. There has been a lot of efforts on the part of Washington to sort of commission India into a broader coalition. But if you look at the writings of Indian strategic thinkers, India has its own position and interest for which its engagement or its sort of its playing role as America's ally in balancing China will be quite limited. Then the second part of the equation would be to empower local opposition forces along China's continental peripheries. That can be all the way from, promoting religious liberties or exposing human rights abuses in places like Tibet and Xinjiang, all the way to diplomatic sort of engagements in Indochina and Myanmar, and some more vicious things, such as actually supporting armed groups in those places. So this is a sort of like conceptual and theoretical 30,000 feet level views of how different frontiers figure in China's foreign policy and what that means for the United States. And I didn't really have time to go over all the specifics, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And thanks for your time. Thanks for your time joining us in the morning.
Thanks, Diane. That was an excellent presentation. I'll kick it off with a few questions of my own, and then we'll open up for the audience to get in here too. My first is it's just kind of a broader overview type question. So in your paper, you say that China prioritizes its frontiers based on their roles as either buffers or resource centers or lines of communication. And I'm wondering, how do you think China decides which of those functions should take precedence in its geopolitical calculus? So when it's weighing these different values and these different priorities, what do you think is the calculus or the framework that it uses to make decisions in that regard?
So for a long time, I think border defense or frontier defense has been more important objective of the PLA. If I have read the literature correctly, but even before that, I think the People's Republic of China, I think the primary objective is to maintain the regime security. So whatever that, whichever factor that sort of affects the regime security comes first in line. And from a geopolitical perspective, beyond this border, I think securing buffer is the most important thing. But as I've mentioned in the article and just in the presentation quickly as well, Taiwan is the invasion of Taiwan is really hard to pull off. So unless the Taiwanese president declares independence one day, waking up, which I don't think will happen. I think China will try to maintain status quo, and as long as the cross-domain deterrence between the United States and China is maintained, I think there's very little room for China to actually pull off military invasion. It has been doing different things, gray zone operations. Some people call it an anaconda strategy, and so on and so forth. But for now, I think buffer zones have been secured. Well, aside from Taiwan, traditional buffer zone has been up north and east. By east, I mean the Korean Peninsula. If you look, I just showed the Japan's invasion map of China, which came all the way through the Korean Peninsula, but North Korea still exists. And there were, I think, 10 years ago, there were debates within Beijing on whether North Korea has become strategic debt liability or not. And I think, at the time being, that debate was premature. And I still do think it is premature as well. And Mongolia, I think China basically abandoned the idea of annexing Mongolia. Mongolia is actually an interesting case because Mongolia and Taiwan are two geographic objectives that the PRC could not recover that used to belong to the Qing Empire. And now, because Mongolia has become very pliant and it is economically so dependent upon China, it can basically serve as a buffer even without actually occupying it. So these places are pretty stable. And if you look at the Western frontier, that is the reason why Pakistan and Kazakhstan and these Central Asian and Western Asian countries are important. As for Indian and the border with India, I think the Himalayan mountains have basically served as a quasi buffer, even though that has not prevented conflict completely, but recall that the Sino-Indian War of 1962 was pretty short.
Okay, I want to go through these theaters, these frontiers one by one. So why don't we start with the eastern frontier? So you just mentioned that you think, given the difficulty of pulling off an amphibious invasion, that it's very unlikely. And in your paper, you describe Taiwan as both a buffer and a resource center for China. What do you make of the argument that it's more than that? That this is the Chinese Civil War, this is a renegade rival Chinese government. It's a democratic system that threatens the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's also just been elevated as part of Xi's political legacy that he seems to want to unify and make China whole again by bringing Taiwan back into the fold. He's given statements that at least somewhat may imply that. And right now, what we've just seen is China's most aggressive, largest show of force, basically showing off a blockade of a potential blockade of Taiwan and completely surrounding it with lots of warships and combat aircraft. So I guess what do you make of the idea that Taiwan goes above and beyond some of the geostrategic interests that you've mentioned? And when you look at what China is doing and the way that it's reacting, and the Chinese specifically said, we feel like we have to threaten Taiwan because they're inching towards independence, and the DPP party that's in power there says the only reason we haven't declared independence is because Taiwan already is sovereign effectively. So in other words, you mentioned that China wants to maintain the status quo, but couldn't it be argued that the status quo is getting worse for China over time as Taiwan seems to be drifting away, and that this isn't just a geostrategic set of interests for China, but there's emotional and historical baggage as well as the ambitions of a dictator that need to be factored in here as well?
Right. Well, excellent question, Mike. And I want to emphasize that any theoretical or analytical framework is limited by design. And if your theory or if your framework claims to do everything, it does not mean anything actually. And I think that is one limit of geopolitical analysis. You cannot really factor in emotional things. And from my vantage point, geopolitics is fundamentally a materialist theory, and that is one of the blind spots. But as I've briefly mentioned just now, I think the PRC's primary objective is domestic regime security, and I think Taiwan sort of comes into play from that perspective. So I think that's one of the reasons why it has been very draconian, especially after Xi Jinping came into power in places like Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So as you mentioned, it's a historical legacy of Taiwan is intricately is very closely linked to this domestic sort of the legitimacy of regime and so on and so forth. And second part of the argument, not the argument that I presented here, but I think the basically how to think about where states expand is that states, I think, expand into places where it is easiest to do. So there's all the historical examples we can muster, but that is, for example, if you look back into the Schlieffen Plan before World War One, the one of the reasons why German planners decided to attack France instead of Russia, although they were facing the two-front war, was that France they thought was easier to conquer. And by the same token, there are a lot of historical examples. Why it was Portuguese and the Spaniards that crossed the ocean, not the Chinese, and so on and so forth. Well, because they were facing the Atlantic. So these are very like outlandish or grand historical examples, but if you look at the specific things and from my sort of own research, I think states tend to expand into places where there's easier. And I think that is why it is so important for the United States and its allies to maintain deterrence on the Taiwan Strait. Because if Chinese think that the balance of power in the Strait has shifted in its favor, I think there's a good chance that it would resort to something that is pretty risky. There was good research. There's a good chapter by Joshua Rovner about the cross-strait deterrence, where he argues basically that when the two sides think that the balance is changing in one side's favor, there's a chance that the continental power can cross into the maritime domain and vice versa. So I think that is one of the reasons why I think it's important.
Okay. What about in the southern frontier? I mean, in recent months, we've seen China becoming fairly aggressive towards the Philippines, blasting Filipino ships with water cannons and dazzling them with lasers and pulling out knives and threatening to board Filipino ships. And then you've also seen China starting to turn the screw on Vietnam to some degree. So is this kind of behavior plus the artificial islands that we've seen China build and militarize and the mobilization of this maritime militia of hundreds, if not thousands, of fishing vessels and Coast Guard vessels and all kinds of other ships that can be essentially commandeered and used as a militia to assert China's territorial claims there. Do you think that this is fundamentally driven by that Malacca dilemma? So, in other words, the South China Sea is just a vital waterway for China, and in a time of rising geopolitical tensions, the fear of being cut off from vital raw materials and energy resources just forces China to expand in this way? Or do you think that there's something more going on here? What's the right way? Like, because some people look at these and say, why are these countries picking all these fights over rocks that are out in the South China Sea that are covered in bird poop? That doesn't seem like fishing rights or whatever else that people typically cite are really what's driving it. So how do you assess these ongoing conflicts in the South China Sea?
So one of the things that I've learned over time is that if you follow news by the minutes, you actually get lost in the weeds. So it is hard to know whether it is driven by it is targeted for domestic audience or actually it has some geostrategic interest in it. But one way to think about it, which I'm trying to argue, is that if a geographic objective offers concrete material benefits, I think there's something to it. But if not, I think it's more of a symbolic gesture. So I probably should know more about the particular issue between the China and the Philippines, which I don't have a lot of expertise on. But if this is something similar to the Sengaku Diao, I think it's probably more targeted towards the domestic audience. And
Okay.
there's a
You're
whole
saying
host of
it's a
like
way to rally nationalist sentiment behind the regime, or
um well that what I'm saying is that's one way of looking at it.
okay. What about on the Western frontier? So, China obviously was having this Belt and Road initiative. You showed some really interesting maps of China's infrastructure expansion around all parts of Eurasia, essentially. But what we've seen in recent years is a lot of China's Belt and Road partners, especially across Central Asia, continental Southeast Asia, and then obviously going into sub-Saharan Africa, are suffering from debt distress. They took out these massive Chinese loans, and now, as a share of their GDP, it's basically equivalent to what a lot of countries took out in the 1980s during that third world debt crisis. And now they can't pay them back, and China seems pretty loath to offer debt relief because then the regime would have to explain to the Chinese people why they sank hundreds of billions of dollars into Kazakhstan or Laos or whatever, rather than investing it at home. And China is not offering debt relief and typically is just at best offering these sort of short-term rollovers and credit swaps, basically offering short-term loans so that these countries can pay the interest on their existing loans. That doesn't seem sustainable. And I'm wondering if you see these percolating economic crises eventually bleeding over and causing geopolitical problems for China, because everyone loved China when it was doling out lots of money, but now that China has become the largest debt collector in the world, presumably that changes how a lot of these countries on the Western frontier view China. So what's your assessment of sort of the future of China's ability to stabilize its Western frontier at a time that it looks like there's going to be a fair amount of debt distress and economic crisis in many of these countries?
Right. So I'll give you an interesting example actually. So once the Cold War ended, a lot of Stan countries in Central Asia negotiated their borders with China, and there was one study that argued that uh, so I think the prevailing notion or prevailing sort of scholarly consensus was that China actually made a lot of concessions to these countries. But if you look at the specifics, these countries, the smaller ones, actually ceded more territories to China as a percentage to their total land mass. So I understand that some scholars, experts argue that debt trap diplomacy is not really empirically grounded, but I think you're right. There are some elements, even if it is not by design. I think there are some elements that these things could work in Beijing's favor. Um, but I spoke with somebody pretty recently who said these domestic economic issues, it's going to take some time for those economic issues to transpire into China's foreign policy. It's going to take some time. There's a time lag between the two sort of separate issues. So I do not know much about the Chinese domestic economy and how that sort of transpires into foreign policy. So I will just say that for now, I think it's going to take some time.
I want to work in a question from one of the audience members. Matthew Kennedy asks, how do you view China's competition with Japan over various infrastructure projects and investments in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa? In other words, is there, beyond just China's own unilateral objectives in making these kind of investments across the Western and Southwestern frontier, let's say, is there a geopolitical competition or a geoeconomic competition element where China is sort of looking over its shoulder and looking at what Japan is trying to do and Japan's long-standing investment links to Southeast Asia, and so it's this competitive element also plays a role here?
No, I think that is absolutely right. So if you look at Japan's investments in those places earlier in the Cold War, they were trying to do it primarily for business reasons, but also for trying to get if I remember correctly, try to get a vote and become a permanent National Security Council member. And ODA and FDI were part of that diplomatic strategy, but that was dormant. I'm pretty sure the private sector has been working on it for some time, but that was not very prominent. Those kind of things were not very prominently figured in Japanese foreign policy. And then I think I remember at some point in late 2000s or early 2010s, some Japanese scholars were basically arguing that Japan is a middle power. Now, I think Prime Minister Abe came up with this initiative and has been expanding. And if you go to different places or sessions in DC, there are a lot of like talks about Japan Southeast Asia cooperation, especially on the economic front. So yes, I do think that it's part of the geoeconomic initiative utilizing Japan's really pre-existing investments and economic ties with the region.
Okay. Why don't we move north? So, there's been obviously a lot of talk of China-Russia alliance, some people are calling it, or some people feature it as part of this broader axis that involves other autocratic powers like North Korea, Iran. I'm wondering, in your assessment, you note that this northern frontier has just become less of a security concern, and it certainly seems like China and Russia have this partnership. How sustainable do you think that partnership is? Because on the one hand, there's obviously these conflicts with Western powers in both Europe and Asia that seem to drive Russia and China together. On the other hand, their spheres of influence overlap, you could argue, both in the north, but also in the area we just talked about on the Western frontier. And Russia, as a very proud nation, doesn't seem like it's particularly interested in becoming just a vassal of Beijing. And so is it possible that you'll see this partnership have a rockier future, or do you just think that the geopolitical imperative of contesting Western dominance is going to bring these two powers together for the long haul regardless?
I think the key issue will be how the Russo-Ukrainian war unfolds. So if you look at the statistics of China's oil and gas imports from abroad, the amount of hydrocarbon energy that China has imported from Russia has increased dramatically from 2022 onward, which suggests actually that Russia is becoming much more economically dependent upon China because of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I think Russia leased out Vladivostok to China. And by the way, Vladivostok, I don't read Russian, but I think it actually means the ruler of the East. So As you said, Russia is a very proud nation, but as long as the war is going on and as long as these sanctions are in place, I don't think it has choice. But once that war has ended in some ways, I think Russians will not be very happy with their junior partner position vis-a-vis China. And before the war happened, and this is a little bit dated data, but I was looking at the Sino-Russian energy relations for some time. And what is interesting was that China had money and Russians had gas. So what they wanted to do was that the Chinese wanted to float the interest rate and fix the oil price, whereas the Russians wanted to float the oil price while fixing the interest rates. So their interests are not do not necessarily converge. And oh, by the way, and the Russians took a large chunk of land from the Chinese in the late 19th century. So there are some elements of geostrategic divide. But again, as long as the war is going on, it's going to be Russians will swallow the pill, in my view.
Do you think China might, because it feels like it's now the senior partner, and as you mentioned, Russia took a huge, I believe, is still in possession of the most land that was taken from China during that century of humiliation, um, and so that's got to be an issue, I imagine. And so, and someone from the audience asks, what do you think? I mean, is it possible that China, maybe not through a military invasion of those regions, but just through sort of manifest destiny, because you have so many more Chinese on the Chinese side of the border there. The economy there is dominated, kind of revolves around China's economy much more than Russia's economy there. A lot of the local Russians do trade and other cross-border transactions with people in China, and so they're reliant on that. Could you see over time China expanding its influence into these territories along the border? And then what do you think that would mean for the Sino-Russia partnership going forward?
So wherever China invests a huge amount of money and pours in its population, there have been backlashes, and that has happened historically in other places that are very well endowed. And Russia is no example. There was a New York Times report a few years back on China's investments around the Lake Baikal, which has the largest possession of the fresh water which China needs. So these kind of things happen, but as long as the Russian state needs resources from abroad, I think this relationship will keep going on.
Okay. I mean, given now that we've kind of sketched out some parts of the board here, going forward, how do you think China's strategic challenges across these different regions will play out? Do you see Beijing ultimately focusing on one frontier more than the others, or viewing one frontier as more vulnerable? Some people think basically the maritime domain is where China is going to be focusing, but you've also highlighted a lot of the challenges that China has along its continental frontiers. And in a scenario where these global conflicts continue to escalate, do you see that forcing China to concentrate, kind of like we're having these debates in the United States? Should you be focusing more on Europe or the Middle East or East Asia? Do you see China having a similar kind of debate, and how do you think it will ultimately play out, just given global trends right now?
Right. I think that is one of the blind spots of contemporary international relations literature, because at the end of the Cold War, a lot of people, maybe not a lot of people, but some prominent articles made this argument that Europe would become like multipolarity, and some sort of security vacuum will destabilize the region and so on and so forth. And then some people started arguing circa 2000s that the United States would have to focus on the Asia Pacific, but with things happening in other frontiers of the United States cannot actually concentrate on one frontier for now, and that is creating debate, as you've just mentioned. I think within China also, there are some debates, I think, taking place at the broad grand strategic level. Some people, and I think it's the typical dilemma of hybrid power, like land versus sea. And obviously, if you look at more granular things, people are probably making the arguments about the specific locations that their nation has to focus on. Um, And I have had this discussion with colleagues who are much better versed about Chinese domestic politics and strategic dialogues than I am, and they think, um, China will not focus on one particular frontier and try to pursue multi-vector expansion. That could be true, but I think it also depends on what the United States do, and for which I added a little section on policy implications. So I think if there's substantially I think if there is a significant instability in one of the two frontiers that I've mentioned, well, one of the three actually. So if North Korea collapses, which is unlikely to happen, in my view, at least in the next, next 3 to 5 years, or some sort of like big things happen in Myanmar or Pakistan, or even Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan. Uh, I mean, these things can actually create uh, uh, sort of a momentum for China that is deviating from its strategic dialogue. So, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned those policy implications for the US. So, if you are able to brief the next presidential administration, whatever it is, what would be the key takeaways for American policymakers from your analysis? And in particular, is there a way that the United States can counterbalance China's expansion without direct military engagement?
Hold the line at sea, forge a balancing coalition on the continent, and empower the local oppositions. That's the sort of like a punchline that I would give. I I'm a junior academic, having never really served within the government, so I wouldn't probably know all the specifics or granular things about how the U.S. government works or how the policymaking actually works, and a lot of different tools that the United States government has in its hand, and my knowledge as an outside analyst is pretty limited. But I'm pretty sure the diplomats and military officers on the ground have been or thinking about things that I've just that I'm talking about.
Well, what about threat assessment then? So, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of which, Navy SEAL team should be doing stuff on Taiwan or which, Marine unit should be landing on what island and with what missile system. But in terms of how you would advise the United States to prioritize potential threats or look for opportunities. So, and I want to tie in a question from the audience here. I mean, earlier you mentioned that an amphibious invasion looks pretty difficult, if not impossible, for China to pull off. Does that also apply for some of the other options that people have floated for how China could coerce or try to conquer Taiwan? So whether a blockade or a series of strategic attacks, cyber attacks, missile bombardments, or an offshore island seizure, do you see all of those as just being too difficult for China to pull off? And so ironically, the United States doesn't need to do much to, as you put it, hold the line in the maritime domain, or do you see some of these as potential options for Beijing, and therefore the United States has to do above and beyond what it's currently doing to hold the line there?
So as for Taiwan specifically, I have a separate project looking at different scenarios or different sort of like groups of situations, and we this is a co-author project, and we come up with sort of like a three typologies of situation. One is gray zone scenario where China will use non-kinetic means to sort of demoralize and sort of rattle the Taiwanese society. The second part is quarantine/blockade, where China uses some degree of kinetic means without actually targeting the mainland Taiwan. The final one is full scale invasion. And I think Andrew Krapinovich has this foreign affairs article where he talks about fait accompli strategy using missile force. I think the Taiwanese holding the line. I think a lot of things. I mean, in large part depends on two things: the Taiwanese will to resist and the U.S. support. So if either one of the two is not met, I think there's a possibility that China can pull it off. And during World War II, I think there are two different Mediterranean campaigns. One was Crete, and the other was Malta. Crete was I think conquered by the Germans, but Malta, the Royal Navy was held it off. multiple different things. The Italian Navy had the proximity, but the Royal Navy was much more skilled and so on and so forth. So there are different models and there are different assumptions, but the reason why I mentioned that Taiwan, sort of like a cross-strait balance would hold was premised on two things. Again, Taiwanese will to resist in U.S. intervention. So if these two conditions are not met, probably, they can do that. But still, even with that, it's going to be pretty hard.
What about with the tensions in the South China Sea and on the Indian border? Does that open up opportunities for the United States in terms of trying to contain Chinese expansion? So you've probably read articles by Evan Montgomery, for example, who is basically advocating, it might be good if there's sort of fires being lit on China's continental frontier because it draws attention and resources away from the maritime domain where US interests are much more vital. Do you share that assumption? Is there anything the United States can really do, or is it just sort of hoping that India continues to assert its control over those contested areas and you just sort of stand on the sidelines and applaud? Or in the South China Sea, just hope that all of the countries that have coastlines along that sea continue to build up their forces to deter China. And so you're just sort of watching from the sidelines. Is there anything proactive the United States should be doing within these areas, especially given that for the most part, we're not talking about formal US allies here. If you're talking about Vietnam or Indonesia or India. So does that sort of limit US options, or do you think that there are positive things the US could do here?
So one thing about the South China Sea is that China has multiple sort of like parties that it has beefs with, and China's behavior in the South and although Laos and Cambodia are almost they are almost like a client states, but I think there's a room to sort of like move the needle with regard. I mean, then the Philippines, Duterte was full on board with the Chinese, but I think the Philippines is coming back. Um, and Vietnam, I think if it feels it is sufficiently supported by the United States, or if it feels confident about its ability to sort of resist Chinese demands, I think it will not sort of like tip over. Malaysia, Thailand, and these countries actually, I think there's a room for a U.S. Diplomatic maneuver. Um, Burma is an interesting case. I mean, Myanmar is an interesting case. It has it has a lot of different domestic factions, and China is involved in all sorts of places. So maybe it might create an opening. As for India, if I understand it correctly, I think all the locations that China values, it actually has established effective control, and India was really awakened to the India was really alarmed with the recent border clash. But if you read things written by people like External Minister Jay Shankar, actually India has its own set of interests that may or may not be aligned with those of the United States. So if you talk to the Indian strategic thinkers, I would doubt that actually they would want to get involved in, say, for example, a Taiwan contingency or any type of, like conflicts or that they might consider as proxy war.
Okay. Well, on that note, we'll leave it here. Jaehyun Park, thank you so much for sharing your insights, for staying up late for all of us. We look forward to seeing how your projects come out and especially getting our hands on this book. Maybe we can have another event that goes through some of the history once that's out. But thank you so much to everyone that attended, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'm a big fan of FPRI again and your work, Mike. So I really appreciate it. It was an honor. Thank you.
Happy to have you. See you next time.